The mansion was alive with lights, laughter, and the soft clinking of crystal glasses. It was one of those parties that seemed almost unreal, where everything sparkled and shimmered and the air was filled with the scent of expensive perfumes and rich food. Guests arrived in long, elegant dresses and perfectly tailored suits, moving with confidence and charm, talking in low, polished voices that carried an air of importance. Outside, sleek cars were lined up like a parade of power, and the valet moved quickly, opening doors and taking bags with practiced efficiency. It was a night meant to impress, and every detail had been carefully planned to show the world the wealth and status of the host. In the midst of this dazzling crowd, a young maid quietly moved from one group to another. She carried trays of champagne and delicate hors d'oeuvres, her movements precise, almost invisible. Her uniform was neat but plain, a stark contrast to the glittering gowns and sparkling jewelry around her. She kept her head slightly bowed, careful not to draw attention to herself, and yet she could not help but notice the subtle glances from some guests, the polite nods that were not quite welcoming, and the occasional smirk from those who clearly thought she did not belong. She had worked in the mansion for several months, learning quickly how to move silently and serve efficiently, always aware of the hierarchy and the invisible rules of such grand gatherings. Tonight, however, something felt different. The usual rhythm of her work, moving unnoticed, serving without comment, cleaning up without drawing attention, was interrupted by a new energy in the room. The host, a billionaire known for his charm but also for a certain sharpness in his humor, seemed more animated than usual. He moved through the crowd with that same confident smile, shaking hands, making jokes, and receiving compliments that would make most people blush. But there was something in his eyes as he scanned the room, a spark of mischief that she had learned to recognize from past encounters. He had a way of noticing the small things, the unnoticed people, and sometimes using them as the center of his entertainment. The maid, though young and shy, had grown accustomed to these parties. She knew the sounds, the patterns, the way people moved and spoke. She had watched the guests laugh at stories that were not their own, had seen them exchange looks that said more than words could, and had learned to navigate the maze of etiquette and expectation without a misstep. She liked music and often spent her free moments practicing on the small piano in the staff room, hidden away from prying eyes. It was her escape, her private world where she could create something beautiful and lose herself in the notes and melodies. No one at the mansion knew about her skill. No one had asked, and she had no reason to share it. Her talent was hers alone, a secret tucked away beneath the apron and careful posture of a maid. But tonight, that secret was about to come dangerously close to the surface. The billionaire's sharp eyes had found her across the room. He was watching her move gracefully among the guests, carrying trays, nodding politely when someone spoke to her, and retreating without a sound. A small playful smirk formed on his face. He had an idea, one that he thought would amuse his friends and guests, a moment that would draw attention to someone he assumed had no experience beyond her duties. He was curious to see how far she could be pushed, how she would react under pressure. In his mind, it would be entertaining to put her on display, to make her a source of amusement for everyone at the party. The maid, unaware of his gaze, continued her work. She stopped at a group of guests, offering them champagne, smiling politely when they complimented her efficiency. She felt a familiar sense of satisfaction when her movements went unnoticed, when she could serve without anyone noticing the effort it took. It was a skill she was proud of, one she had honed over months of work, and it gave her a quiet confidence in the midst of so much opulence. Yet even as she moved through the room, she felt a tiny flutter of nervousness, a sense that tonight might be different, though she could not have said why. The billionaire approached her suddenly, breaking the rhythm of her movements. "You there," he said, his voice smooth but commanding. She turned, startled, and looked up at him. His eyes were sharp, assessing, and there was that hint of a playful challenge in them. "Do you play the piano?" he asked, tilting his head slightly, expecting perhaps a quick denial or an embarrassed laugh. The question took her by surprise. She had never been asked about her music in such a context, certainly not in front of all these people. I play a little," she said softly, unsure how much to reveal, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the tray she had been carrying. She had been careful to keep her talent hidden, fearing judgment or disbelief if anyone discovered it. The billionaire's smile widened, though it was not quite kind. "A little?" "Why don't we see then?" he said, almost teasing, almost daring her. The tone was playful on the surface, but underneath it carried the expectation that she would fail, that she would provide entertainment through her nervousness rather than her skill. He gestured toward the grand piano in the corner of the room, a magnificent instrument that gleamed under the soft lights. The guests noticed the interaction and began to turn their heads, curious about the sudden attention drawn to the maid. Whispers began to ripple through the room, some amused, some skeptical, and a few genuinely curious. Her heart pounded in her chest. She had never performed in front of anyone outside the privacy of her own practice sessions, and certainly not in a room filled with strangers who expected her to stumble. Every instinct told her to say no, to retreat quietly, and to disappear back into the safety of her duties. But something inside her, a quiet determination, a stubborn streak she had carried since childhood, made her take a small step toward the piano. She set down the tray carefully, wiping her hands on a cloth before touching the keys. The room grew quieter as she approached, the murmurs fading into a tense silence. The guests, sensing that a spectacle was about to unfold, began to watch more intently. Some exchanged smiles, anticipating a moment of light-hearted humor at the expense of the maid. Others whispered among themselves, curious about what might happen. The billionaire leaned back slightly, confident in the entertainment he had orchestrated. He did not expect to be surprised. After all, this young maid had never before been in the spotlight. His smirk was barely concealed as he crossed his arms, watching her prepare for what he assumed would be a brief and awkward display. The maid took a deep breath, placing her fingers gently on the keys. She could feel the smooth surface beneath her fingertips, the familiar weight of the piano that had been her companion in so many quiet moments. Her nerves were strong, but they did not overpower her. She closed her eyes for a moment, remembering the hours she had spent practicing, the music that had filled her small room late at night, the melodies that had given her comfort and joy when the world outside felt harsh and demanding. For a fleeting moment, she imagined herself alone, playing not for the guests, not for the billionaire, but for herself, for the music that had always been hers. Then slowly, she began to play. The first notes were soft, hesitant, almost fragile, but perfectly in tune. The sound of the piano filled the room, delicate and clear, cutting through the ambient chatter and music of the party. The guests fell silent, caught off guard by the unexpected skill of someone they had assumed would provide only an awkward performance. The billionaire's smirk faltered slightly as he realized that this was not going according to plan. The young maid's fingers moved with precision and grace, each note deliberate, each chord resonant. She was no longer the timid maid in the corner. She was a musician commanding the room, her confidence growing with every note she played. Some guests leaned forward in their seats, eyes wide with surprise as they recognized the complexity of the piece she was playing. Whispers of admiration began to spread quietly through the crowd. "She's incredible," one person murmured. "I had no idea she could play like that," said another. The billionaire, who had expected laughter and embarrassment, now felt a tightening in his chest, a realization that his plan to amuse himself at someone else's expense was slipping away. As the music continued, the room seemed to transform. The air, once filled with chatter and polite laughter, became almost reverent. Every guest listened, mesmerized by the sound that emanated from the piano. The young maid's talent was undeniable, and with every measure, she grew more comfortable, more confident, her fingers dancing across the keys with a fluidity that could only come from years of dedicated practice. The audience was no longer focused on her status as a maid. They were focused on her skill, her passion, and the beauty of the music she was creating in that very moment. By the time she finished the first piece, there was a stunned silence, followed by a ripple of applause that began softly but grew quickly. The young maid lowered her hands, breathing a little heavily, her face flushed with a mix of nerves and excitement. The billionaire, for the first time that evening, felt something he had not expected: respect. He realized that he had underestimated her, that talent and determination were not defined by status or occupation. The room, once ready to laugh, was now ready to honor, and the maid stood quietly, proud yet composed, as the first seeds of admiration began to take root among the guests. The soft applause that had followed her first piece hung in the air, like a fragile thread connecting the young maid to the rest of the room. She had expected mockery, whispers, or even laughter, but instead she heard quiet admiration. It was strange, almost dizzying to feel the weight of attention directed entirely at her. Her hands hovered briefly over the piano keys, unsure if she should continue or retreat. And in that pause, she could feel every eye in the room on her. The murmurs of astonishment had started to grow. Gentle comments exchanged between guests who could not believe what they were witnessing. The billionaire's expression had shifted from smug amusement to something closer to shock. He had expected her to fumble, to stumble over the keys to provide a moment of entertainment at her expense. Instead, she had commanded the piano with precision and grace, each note perfectly measured, each chord resonating with clarity. His guests were whispering, leaning closer, some exchanging subtle nods of approval. He could see their surprise, their admiration, and for a moment he felt a flicker of unease. This was not how the night was supposed to unfold. The maid, meanwhile, felt her heart pounding in her chest. She had never performed under such circumstances, and yet in the quiet that followed her first piece, a strange confidence began to bloom inside her. The piano, once a private companion in the solitude of her small room, now felt alive beneath her fingers. She could sense the attention of the room, the curiosity and disbelief, and she realized that her music had the power to transform the energy in the space. She took a deep breath and allowed herself to focus, blocking out the judgment she had expected and instead listening to the sound she could create. As her fingers touched the keys again, she began a second piece, one she had learned months ago but had only ever played in private. This time the melody was richer, more intricate, carrying a depth of feeling that resonated through the room. The guests leaned in, silent now, unable to tear their eyes away. Some had come expecting a joke, a brief distraction, and instead found themselves immersed in music that seemed to speak directly to them. The soft notes filled the corners of the grand room, mingling with the gentle hum of chandeliers above and the faint rustle of silk gowns and polished shoes. The billionaire watched in disbelief, his earlier confidence fading with every measure. He had underestimated her, thought her timid demeanor and humble position would limit her abilities. He had assumed that her response would be one of nervous fumbling, that she would shy away under pressure. But she was proving him wrong, defying every expectation he had held about her. His smirk had disappeared, replaced by a tense tightness in his jaw as he realized that the laughter he had imagined for his guests was nowhere in sight. Instead, they were captivated, genuinely impressed, and he could not control the narrative he had tried so carefully to script. Some of the guests began to speak softly among themselves, their voices a mixture of surprise and admiration. "I did not expect that," one whispered to the person beside them. "She is remarkable," said another. A few turned to observe the billionaire, noting the change in his expression. They could see that he had been proven wrong, that the young maid had turned a moment meant for ridicule into one of undeniable talent. The energy in the room had shifted subtly but unmistakably. Where there had been amusement at her expense, there was now respect, fascination, and a growing sense of wonder. The maid's hands moved effortlessly across the piano, her fingers dancing with a fluidity born from years of quiet practice. Each note carried emotion, a story, a feeling that transcended the expectation of her audience. She was no longer merely performing, she was expressing herself, sharing the music that had lived in her heart for so long. The room seemed to respond to her, the earlier chatter and casual laughter replaced by a focused silence. Even the servers paused for a moment in the corners, trays held carefully, unwilling to disturb the fragile beauty of what was unfolding. The billionaire, standing slightly apart, began to feel a sense of unease he had not experienced before. He had hosted countless parties, seen performances, and orchestrated moments of amusement for his guests, but this was different. He had not anticipated the power of her talent the way it could hold a room in awe. There was a sharp lesson forming in his mind. Assumptions could be dangerous, and underestimating someone could have consequences he had not expected. He found himself watching her with a mixture of curiosity and reluctant respect, trying to reconcile his desire to control the situation with the undeniable fact of her skill. The maid, aware of the attention but determined not to falter, moved into a third piece, one that was more challenging, demanding faster movements and more precision. Her fingers flew over the keys, the music swelling and falling with a rhythm that captivated the listeners. Some guests could not help but lean closer, their eyes wide, mouths slightly open in astonishment. Others exchanged quiet smiles, recognizing the dedication and practice that must have gone into such a performance. It was clear that this was no moment of chance, no accidental talent. This was the result of years of commitment, patience, and love for music. Her breathing was steady now, controlled, even as adrenaline surged through her body. The fear that had gripped her moments ago had been replaced by a quiet determination. She had faced the challenge, had taken the risk of exposing her talent in a room full of strangers, and she was rising to the occasion. The music was no longer a secret. It was a gift she was offering, and the room was receiving it with open hearts. She felt a strange warmth in her chest, a connection forming between herself and the audience, a bond created by shared experience and pure admiration. As she continued, the mood of the room transformed further. Guests who had once glanced with curiosity now sat fully attentive, some nodding their heads to the rhythm, others closing their eyes to absorb the sound fully. The chatter that had accompanied the beginning of the evening had faded completely. Even those who had been skeptical or expecting humor at her expense now found themselves completely engaged. The young maid was no longer an observer, no longer someone to be dismissed. She was the center of attention, commanding respect through the simple yet profound power of her music. The billionaire, feeling a mix of embarrassment and admiration, realized the impact of his earlier actions. What had started as a plan to entertain his guests at her expense had backfired spectacularly. He had underestimated her courage, her skill, and her ability to rise above humiliation. The room had shifted from a scene of potential ridicule to one of collective amazement. He could not deny the talent in front of him, nor could he undo the impression it had made on his guests. It was a humbling moment, one that challenged his assumptions and forced him to see the young maid not as a servant, but as an artist in her own right. The maid, finishing the third piece, allowed herself a brief moment to pause. Her hands hovered over the keys, and she looked up to meet the eyes of the guests. She saw admiration, surprise, and respect reflected back at her, and for the first time that evening, she felt fully seen, not as a maid, not as someone to be underestimated, but as a talented musician with the courage to perform under pressure. Her pulse was still quick, but it was no longer fear-driven. It was excitement, joy, and a quiet pride in what she had achieved. Some of the guests began to clap softly, unsure at first how to react, but then with increasing enthusiasm. The applause spread slowly at first, then more confidently until it filled the room. The young maid smiled softly, her fingers lingering on the piano keys, and she realized that she had not only played music, but had also transformed the perception of those around her. She had shown them that talent and courage could not be measured by appearance or social standing, that skill and dedication could shine even in the most unlikely places. The billionaire, finally clapping along, did so reluctantly, but there was a newfound respect in his eyes. He had learned a lesson in humility, a reminder that assumptions could be wrong and that people were capable of surprising even the most confident observers. The maid, though still shy and reserved in her nature, had become a symbol of quiet strength and extraordinary talent. She had turned a moment meant for embarrassment into one of triumph, showing everyone in the room that her abilities were worthy of admiration, not ridicule. As the applause continued and guests whispered among themselves, the maid carefully lifted her hands from the keys, feeling a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. Her heart still raced, but now it was fueled by pride and a sense of accomplishment. She had faced the unexpected challenge, had embraced her talent in front of strangers, and had emerged stronger and more confident. The room had shifted around her, and she had become the center of admiration, not as a figure of fun, but as someone who had earned respect through courage, skill, and the beauty of her music. The room had changed completely from the moment the young maid began playing. Where there had once been polite chatter and polite smiles, now there was quiet focus and wide-eyed admiration. The guests had all shifted in their seats, some leaning forward, some standing in corners to get a better view. The soft glow of chandeliers reflected in their eyes as they watched someone they had once overlooked, now command attention with nothing more than the music coming from the grand piano. The young maid sat with a straight back, her hands poised over the keys, her fingers moving almost like they had a mind of their own, carrying the notes effortlessly across the room. The billionaire, who had orchestrated this moment hoping for amusement, felt a strange tension in his chest. He had underestimated her. At first it had seemed like a harmless bit of fun, an opportunity to entertain the room at her expense, but now he was caught off guard. His carefully maintained aura of control and confidence felt suddenly fragile. He could see the change in the room, the shift in energy, and he could not deny it. She was captivating everyone. The smirk he had worn so casually earlier had vanished, replaced by a tight-lipped frown and a growing sense of unease. For the first time that evening, he had no idea what would happen next. The maid, feeling the room's attention, took a small, steadying breath. She had been nervous at first, her heart racing, but now she felt a strange calm. The music had become a language she spoke without hesitation, a bridge connecting her to everyone in the room. She played the first notes of a more difficult piece, one that required both speed and delicacy, and the audience leaned in as if sensing the challenge in her hands. She could feel their curiosity, their anticipation, and instead of fear, it fueled her. The keys responded to her touch, each sound precise, deliberate, and full of emotion. As the piece progressed, the audience began to respond in subtle ways. Some nodded their heads gently to the rhythm, others closed their eyes as if to absorb every note fully. Even the billionaire found himself shifting uncomfortably, realizing he could not tear his eyes away from her performance. It was mesmerizing, and he could feel a growing unease as he watched her transform a room filled with skepticism into one of genuine admiration. He had intended for her to feel small, to falter under pressure, but instead, she had grown in confidence with every chord, every melody, every delicate nuance. The maid's hands moved faster now, dancing across the keys with skill and precision that left no room for doubt. She had never been someone who sought attention. In fact, she had spent most of her life moving quietly, blending into the background, but the music allowed her to step into the light without fear, without apology. Each note was a statement, a gentle declaration of her ability, her dedication, and her courage. The guests were enthralled, unable to look away. They were witnessing a private talent revealed in a public setting, a skill so unexpected that it felt almost magical. Some of the guests, initially skeptical, now whispered to each other in awe. "She's incredible," one said quietly. "I would never have guessed," replied another. There were small smiles and nods exchanged, subtle gestures of recognition that she was something extraordinary. The young maid's fingers moved faster still, keeping pace with the music, but never once did she stumble. Each chord rang clear, each note flowed effortlessly into the next, and the room seemed to hold its breath, caught in the spell of her playing. The billionaire, feeling the unexpected shift in energy, began to understand the impact of underestimating someone. He had intended for her to be embarrassed, to provide a brief moment of entertainment at her expense, but instead she was shining. He could see it in the faces around him, the surprise, the admiration, the genuine respect, and he knew he had miscalculated. For the first time, he experienced what it meant to be powerless in a room full of people. He could not stop her, could not redirect attention, could not take away the awe she had created. He had assumed control, but she had taken it effortlessly with her music. The maid, sensing the subtle change in the billionaire's expression, felt a mix of nervousness and satisfaction. She did not seek revenge or recognition. She simply wanted to play. But she could feel the room responding to her, and with each note she grew more confident. She played a passage that was both delicate and fast, her hands moving with precision and grace, the notes flowing smoothly into a melody that filled every corner of the grand hall. Guests leaned closer, some holding their breath, some whispering quietly to each other, all captivated by the display of raw talent and poise before them. As the piece reached its climax, the room seemed to vibrate with the music. The sound was powerful yet gentle, commanding yet tender. The young maid's expression remained focused, her eyes on the keys. But she could feel the presence of the audience in a new way. They were no longer observers. They were participants in a moment of beauty and emotion that could not be ignored. The energy in the room shifted again, this time with a sense of shared experience. People felt something beyond the music itself. They felt the courage and the heart behind it. The billionaire, still standing at a distance, could not help but admire her skill. He had tried to make her the subject of amusement, but instead she had become the center of admiration. His mind raced, thinking about the assumptions he had made, the moment he had tried to control, and how completely it had slipped from him. He could see the truth now. Her talent was real, her confidence genuine, and her courage undeniable. The lesson was clear, and it was one he could not ignore. Meanwhile, the maid moved into the final section of the piece, the part that required both emotion and technical skill. Her fingers danced across the keys with fluidity, the music rising and falling with a rhythm that seemed to carry the room along with it. Guests sat in awe, leaning in, feeling the beauty of each note. Some were close to tears, moved by the unexpected depth of the performance. Others were smiling, their admiration evident, their previous judgments forgotten. The room was transformed, not by the grandeur of the mansion or the wealth of its owner, but by the quiet power of someone who had dared to share their talent. For a moment, the young maid allowed herself a small smile. She had played, she had faced the pressure, and she had emerged stronger. Her music had not only captivated the audience, but had also changed the dynamics of the room. She was no longer simply a maid serving guests. She had become the focal point of admiration, the reason everyone had stopped what they were doing to listen. The transformation was remarkable, not only for those watching but for herself as well. She had discovered something within her that went beyond skill. It was courage, determination, and the ability to rise above fear. As the final notes of the piece faded into silence, the room stayed still for a heartbeat, as if no one wanted to break the spell. Then slowly soft applause began to ripple through the guests. One by one they joined in, the sound growing until the room was filled with genuine appreciation. The young maid lowered her hands from the keys, breathing slightly heavier than before, her face glowing with a mix of pride and relief. She had done what she had never imagined she could do, and she had done it beautifully. The billionaire, standing slightly apart, clapped too, though his expression was complex. There was admiration, yes, but also a touch of embarrassment, a realization that he had misjudged someone he thought he understood. The guests turned toward him as well, sensing his change in attitude, and some exchanged small smiles. They could see that the dynamic of the evening had shifted entirely. The young maid had not only impressed everyone with her talent, but had also challenged the assumptions and judgments of the room. After the applause settled, the room buzzed quietly with conversation. Guests spoke in hushed tones, pointing out particular moments in the performance, commenting on the skill and emotion displayed. They speculated about how long she had been practicing, what her life might be like outside of work, and how someone with such quiet presence could hold such powerful talent. The young maid, still standing by the piano, listened quietly, her heart swelling with a sense of accomplishment. She had faced a challenge she had never anticipated, and she had not only met it but exceeded all expectations. The billionaire approached her finally, his steps deliberate. He could see her nervous posture, the way she still clutched herself slightly as if unsure of how to react to all the attention. He realized that he had been cruel in his intentions, trying to orchestrate a moment of humiliation, and now he felt a mix of guilt and respect. When he spoke, his tone was measured but sincere. "I underestimated you," he said quietly. "That was remarkable." The young maid nodded politely, not needing to speak much. Her music had spoken for her, and now the room, including its host, understood her worth in a way that words alone could not convey. The night continued, but the atmosphere had changed entirely. The young maid moved back to her duties, still carrying trays and serving quietly, yet she walked with a newfound sense of dignity. Guests whispered to each other, admiring her resilience and talent, while the billionaire, watching from a distance, reflected on the lesson he had just learned. The power of assumptions, the danger of underestimating someone, and the undeniable strength of quiet talent had all been laid bare in a single performance. The young maid had not only captivated a room, but had also transformed the perceptions of everyone present, leaving a lasting impression that would be remembered long after the party ended. The applause after her performance had not only filled the room, but had lingered in the air, leaving a strange sense of awe among the guests. The young maid stood beside the grand piano, her hands still hovering lightly over the keys, feeling the warmth of the moment she had just created. She had faced something she had never imagined, played music in front of strangers, and yet here she was, calm, composed, and quietly proud. The guests who had arrived expecting glamour and casual entertainment were now completely captivated by someone they had underestimated from the very beginning. The room seemed to pulse with energy. Conversations had slowed to whispers, and people were glancing at her with a mix of surprise and admiration. Some had even forgotten to eat or drink, their attention entirely fixed on the young maid who had transformed a simple piano performance into a moment of shared emotion. It was a subtle, powerful shift, one that showed the impact of talent and courage. Those who had laughed or smirked earlier were now wide-eyed, leaning forward in their seats, unable to ignore the extraordinary skill that had emerged in front of them. The billionaire, still standing slightly apart, felt a tightening in his chest. He had expected to control the narrative of the evening, to orchestrate a scene that would amuse his guests at someone else's expense. He had imagined laughter, whispered jokes, and perhaps a brief moment of embarrassment for the maid. But instead, the room had changed completely. Every expectation he had held had been overturned. He realized that his plan to amuse himself had backfired spectacularly, and in its place had emerged something he had not anticipated: genuine admiration for someone he had assumed was insignificant. As the maid glanced around, she noticed the subtle shifts in the guests' expressions. Eyes widened, small smiles appeared, and nods of acknowledgement were exchanged. She had expected ridicule or amusement, perhaps even nervous laughter directed at her, but instead she saw respect. It was a quiet, powerful respect, one that did not need words to be understood. In that moment, she understood that her music had the power to speak for her, to communicate what she had never been able to say aloud. It was a feeling she had never experienced before in a public setting, and it filled her with a sense of calm and quiet pride. The billionaire, now approaching her cautiously, seemed unsure of how to respond. His usual confidence, the same confidence that allowed him to host lavish parties and command attention effortlessly, was tempered by a realization that he had misjudged her completely. He could see that she had not only handled the pressure with grace, but had also captivated the entire room. There was no way to turn the evening back to the way he had imagined it. She had taken control with her music, and there was nothing he could do to change it. Guests began to speak among themselves more openly now, sharing their admiration and curiosity. "I did not expect that at all," one whispered to a friend. "She is extraordinary," said another, their voice filled with genuine awe. There was a sense of excitement, a spark of wonder that had replaced the initial assumptions of ridicule. People were no longer thinking of her as the maid who served drinks and snacks. They were thinking of her as an artist, someone who had a gift that demanded attention. The atmosphere had shifted from casual entertainment to something more profound, a collective acknowledgement of talent and courage that could not be ignored. The young maid, sensing the room's focus on her, felt a mixture of emotions. Nervousness lingered, of course, but it had been replaced largely by a sense of purpose. She realized that her music had the ability to transform not only the space around her, but also the perceptions of those who were present. Every note she had played, every chord she had pressed, had told a story. It was a story of quiet dedication, of long hours spent practicing alone, of a love for music that had been her private companion for so long. Now that story was no longer private. It was shared, experienced, and appreciated. The billionaire, still observing her, seemed to struggle with his own emotions. He had underestimated her, and that realization was a humbling one. The audience had responded with admiration, but he could not deny a growing respect for her as well. She had handled the pressure of performing in front of a room full of strangers with grace, skill, and courage. He had attempted to create a moment of embarrassment, but instead, she had created a moment of inspiration. He realized that talent and strength were not always obvious, that they could exist quietly beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. As the guests began to approach the piano, they did so cautiously, unsure of how to interact with someone they had so recently underestimated. Some asked questions about how long she had been practicing. Others commented on the difficulty of the pieces she had played. There was genuine curiosity, a desire to understand the depth of her talent. The young maid answered softly, politely, never boasting, always humble. She had not expected attention or praise, and yet she accepted it gracefully, her quiet demeanor contrasting with the excitement of those around her. The energy in the room continued to build as more guests lingered near the piano, drawn by both the music and the story it represented. They had seen someone rise above expectation, someone take a moment that could have been humiliating and turn it into something beautiful. The room had shifted from a scene of wealth and status to a scene of human achievement, a subtle but profound change that left everyone present feeling inspired. It was a reminder that talent and courage could be found in unexpected places, that appearances could be misleading, and that respect could not be earned through status alone. The billionaire, Watching this quietly felt a mix of emotions. He had intended to control the evening, to provide amusement for his guests, and yet he found himself powerless in the face of her talent. It was a humbling experience, one that forced him to reconsider his assumptions. He could see now that the young maid had a strength that could not be underestimated, a quiet resilience and skill that demanded recognition. He realized that the world was larger and more complex than his previous assumptions had allowed him to see. The young maid, feeling the attention, remained composed, her hands resting lightly on the piano keys. She had played, she had shared her music, and now she felt the impact of her courage and dedication. She had faced a challenge she had never anticipated, and she had risen to it in a way that left everyone in the room changed. The guests' admiration was evident, but there was also a deeper sense of connection, an understanding that she had revealed something profoundly human. The music had spoken not only to them but also to the truths that existed quietly in their own lives. The value of talent, courage and determination, and the power of humility. Some guests approached her cautiously, complimenting her performance, asking questions about the pieces she had played, and expressing surprise at the depth of her skill. Others simply observed quietly, unwilling to interrupt but clearly moved by the experience. The room was no longer a place of casual entertainment. It had become a space of respect, acknowledgement, and quiet celebration of human talent. Each note she had played had carried meaning, and the guests responded not just to the music but to the courage behind it. The billionaire, finally speaking, chose his words carefully. "I underestimated you," he said softly, his voice reflecting a mixture of sincerity and humility. "What you just did? It was remarkable." The young maid nodded politely, a quiet smile on her face. She did not need further praise. Her music had spoken for her, yet she felt a subtle sense of satisfaction, knowing that the perception of those around her had shifted, that she had earned respect not through words but through her skill and determination. As the evening continued, the atmosphere in the room remained transformed. Guests moved with a new awareness, carrying with them a sense of admiration for someone they had once overlooked. The young maid returned to her duties, but she did so with a newfound confidence. She had faced a situation she had never anticipated, had played her music in a way that inspired and captivated, and had emerged stronger, more assured of her own abilities. The lessons of courage, talent, and humility lingered not only with her, but with everyone who had witnessed the performance. The party itself seemed different after that moment. Conversations were quieter, more thoughtful, and there was a shared acknowledgement of the extraordinary talent that had been revealed. The young maid moved among the guests, serving with the same care as before, but now with a subtle glow of pride and confidence. People noticed her presence in a new way, no longer seeing her as simply a maid, but as someone who had shared something deeply meaningful. The energy of the room had shifted from superficial entertainment to genuine admiration, a change that would linger long after the party had ended. Even the billionaire, watching her now, understood the significance of what had occurred. He had intended to create amusement at her expense, but instead, she had turned the situation into a display of courage, talent, and quiet strength. He could not take back the experience, nor would he want to. He had learned something important, that assumptions could be dangerous, that talent could exist in unexpected places, and that respect was earned through skill, courage, and authenticity, not wealth or status. By the end of the evening, the young maid had become more than a server in the room. She had become a symbol of quiet strength and hidden talent. Her performance had changed the way the guests thought, the way the billionaire perceived the world around him, and most importantly, it had changed the way she saw herself. She had discovered her own ability to rise above fear, to embrace her talent in the face of challenge, and to inspire others through the simple power of music. The night was slowly drawing to a close, but the energy in the grand mansion had not dimmed. The soft lights reflected off crystal chandeliers, casting gentle patterns across the polished floors and lavish furniture. Guests had begun to gather their belongings, murmuring about the evening's unexpected highlight. Many lingered, unwilling to leave the memory of what they had just witnessed behind. The young maid, who had captured the attention and admiration of everyone in the room, moved quietly among the guests, performing her duties as she had done all evening, yet now carrying herself with a quiet confidence she had never felt before. Her mind was still racing with the events of the night. She had faced the pressure of playing in front of strangers in a room filled with expectation and judgment. She had expected laughter, ridicule, perhaps a moment of embarrassment, and yet the result had been nothing she could have imagined. The room had transformed around her, and she had transformed with it. She felt a sense of pride, not the kind that demanded attention, but the kind that comes quietly from knowing you have done your best and that your effort has been recognized. Each step she took carried a subtle weight of accomplishment, a new understanding of her own ability to face challenges and rise above them. The guests who had once whispered or smirked now approached her with a mixture of respect and curiosity. They asked questions about her music, about how long she had been practicing, and what inspired her to continue despite the odds. She answered softly, her voice calm and steady, never boastful, always humble. Her words carried a gentle warmth, a reflection of the grace she had displayed on the piano. People listened closely, captivated not only by her talent but by her quiet demeanor, by the sense of authenticity that radiated from her presence. She had become someone who could hold a room's attention not through wealth or status, but through skill, courage, and the honesty of her character. The billionaire, who had orchestrated the situation with entirely different intentions, observed from a short distance. His earlier amusement had given way to surprise, then to admiration, and finally to something more profound: respect. He realized that he had misjudged the young maid, assuming she was someone to be laughed at rather than someone to be celebrated. Watching her now, answering questions with quiet poise and receiving genuine admiration from the guests, he felt a mix of humility and awe. He had learned an unexpected lesson about underestimating people and the dangers of pride. Talent, courage, and strength could not be measured by appearances, by status, or by any superficial metric. Some of the guests lingered near the piano, unable to leave without expressing their appreciation. They spoke in hushed tones about the dedication and skill it must have taken to achieve such mastery, marveling at the clarity, precision, and emotion in every note. Others exchanged quiet smiles, acknowledging the courage it must have taken to play in such a high-pressure situation. The young maid listened, feeling a warmth in her chest, a subtle recognition that her effort had not gone unnoticed. Her music had created a ripple effect, leaving a lasting impression not only on the audience but on herself. She felt a growing sense of purpose, a knowledge that her talent could reach further than she had ever imagined. The atmosphere in the room had shifted entirely. Where there had once been amusement and expectation of embarrassment, now there was respect and admiration. People who had initially viewed her as merely a servant now saw her as someone extraordinary, someone whose skill could inspire and move. It was a transformation that spoke to a deeper truth. That character, courage, and talent could not be overlooked when given the opportunity to shine. She had stepped into the spotlight not seeking attention, but allowing her abilities to be recognized, and in doing so, she had changed the perceptions of everyone in the room. The billionaire, approaching her with a careful step, finally spoke. His voice was measured, tinged with a humility that had been absent earlier in the evening. "I owe you an apology," he said softly, looking directly at her. "I misjudged you. What you did tonight, it was extraordinary." The young maid nodded politely, accepting his words without embellishment. She had not sought this acknowledgement, yet she understood the significance of it. His recognition was not just a personal triumph. It was a reflection of how perceptions could change, how courage and skill could redefine expectations. Guests continued to approach her, asking for small details about her life, her practice, and how she had come to play so beautifully. She answered with gentle honesty, revealing small pieces of her story while keeping her private moments private. They listened with genuine interest, their admiration evident in the way they leaned in, nodded, and smiled. It was a remarkable reversal of roles. She had been positioned to be humiliated, yet she had become the person everyone wanted to hear from, the individual whose talent and poise had captured the room. The young maid returned to her duties after a few moments, but the simple act of carrying trays, refilling glasses, or adjusting plates now carried a subtle sense of dignity. She moved with a quiet confidence, aware that the room had been transformed not by wealth, not by status, but by the power of her talent and courage. Every glance, every whisper of admiration was a reminder that she had stepped into her own light, proving something to herself and to everyone around her. She had taken a moment that could have been humiliating and turned it into an opportunity for recognition, demonstrating the quiet strength that comes from dedication and authenticity. The billionaire, observing this quietly, could not help but reflect on the broader implications of the evening. He had learned something profound about human potential, about assumptions, and about the courage it takes to rise above expectation. His guests had witnessed a rare moment of genuine talent and humility, a reminder that greatness could exist in places and people that were often overlooked. He realized that his attempts at amusement had been misguided, and that true admiration could not be forced. It had to be earned, and it could come from the most unexpected sources. The guests continued to linger, some reluctant to leave, sharing impressions of the performance, recounting moments that had moved them, and expressing surprise at how deeply they had been affected. The young maid, quietly returning to her tasks, listened to their words, feeling a sense of quiet satisfaction. She had not sought fame or recognition, yet she had earned both through her skill, her courage, and the authenticity of her performance. The room had changed because of her, and in that change, she had discovered her own strength and the power of her abilities. As the night drew to its final moments, the young maid had become more than just a server at a lavish party. She had become a symbol of quiet resilience, of talent revealed in the most unlikely circumstances, and of courage faced under pressure. Her music had created a shared experience, a moment of connection between herself, the guests, and even the billionaire who had once underestimated her. She had proven that skill and character could shine through, regardless of social standing or expectation. The billionaire approached her one final time before the guests departed. His tone was softer now, filled with a mix of respect and admiration. "Tonight was a lesson for all of us," he said. "Not just about talent, but about humility and understanding. You have shown us something remarkable." The young maid nodded, her quiet smile reflecting a sense of fulfillment and calm pride. She did not need to say more. The music she had played and the courage she had shown spoke louder than any words could. As the last guests began to leave, the mansion slowly settled into a calm, quiet state. The chandeliers reflected softly in the now empty hall, and the echoes of applause and conversation lingered in the air. The young maid, standing by the grand piano, allowed herself a deep breath, feeling the satisfaction of a night that had started with nervousness and expectation of humiliation, and had ended in triumph and recognition. She had faced a challenge she had never anticipated, had shared her talent with an audience she had feared, and had emerged stronger, more confident, and more aware of her own worth. In the quiet of the empty mansion, she ran her fingers lightly over the keys once more, not as a performance for others, but as a personal reflection of the evening. The music flowed, soft and deliberate, carrying with it the emotions of the night, the nervousness, the fear, the courage, and finally the pride and fulfillment. She played for herself now in private, in the space where her talent had first been nurtured, and she felt a sense of peace. The night had shown her something profound, that courage, skill, and authenticity could overcome expectation and prejudice, and that respect earned through talent was one of the most powerful forces of all. The billionaire watched quietly from a distance, reflecting on the night and the unexpected lessons it had offered.